top of the hour, what I'll do is we'll I'll when I share the screen, then that will bring in our we'll start the multicast, and then we'll be broadcasting on the different platforms. But anyway, so in what part of you the UK are you in? Are you in London proper?
No, I'm a bit down south of London, so I'm based
Yeah.
in Brighton, which is East Sussex.
Yeah.
And that's where I've moved. So I'm really close to the sea, which is quite nice. Got the sea right in front of my door. Basically, it's like a 15-minute walk, which is
Nice.
quite nice, and a very moderate climate. So that's it's good to be here. And cost of living is definitely lower than, maybe not definitely, but it is a bit lower than London.
Yeah. Good. Hey, Howard.
Hi, Howard.
Hi, Sophie. How are you?
Good, thank you. How are you?
Okay. Crazy time of year.
Yeah, it is. Christmas always gets really busy, even though you don't expect it because you think people go into holiday mode. But it's not the case this year.
We're just talking about Sophie lives just 15 minutes from the beach.
Oh.
It's a pebble beach as well, so you don't get the sand everywhere.
Yeah.
What's the weather like?
Very snowy. So it snowed 2 days ago, and the UK is still out of order. No trains are running. Schools are closed.
Not even the trains.
Wow.
Yeah, well, I think they're back to normal now. But when I came into this office earlier, so this morning at 8 o'clock, I was in the office. None of my co-workers were in. So 3 snowflakes in the UK is out of control.
Yeah, but that's interesting because I didn't realize that the trains would be affected by the weather.
Me neither.
So,
where are you located, Sophie?
In Brighton.
Okay.
Sussex. Yeah.
I know London used to shut down also. A little bit of snow and all of London would shut down.
Yeah. They've got they called out an emergency situation, which I guess makes sense for people who are living on the street. So they try to motivate people to kind of just call in when they see someone that is on the street and that is very cold. Which is a very nice program. They've basically broadcasted it everywhere on social media. So hoping that lots of people are going to participate and help.
oh, that's good. Yeah. So it's and that's the thing in the UK. I guess there's nowhere to go to get warm. And as far as climate here in the US, and a lot of the homeless people actually migrate. They go to warmer places in the winter time. Go south.
That makes sense.
Yeah, even in my town here, there's a town that's like an hour away, and so when it gets cold in my town, the homeless migrate to this other town, and every winter, and so it's kind of a back and forth.
I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, no, there's no way to migrate. Even I think up north is even colder. It's got quite a moderate climate here down south, which is nice. It's only -2 degrees, I think it was yesterday, so it's all right. It could be worse. I mean, I lived in Canada for 6 months. That was really cold.
All right. Well, we still have 3 more minutes before we get started. But so we talked about a lot of things, Howard, in our pre-session. So we're going to be covering as far as the aspects of fair pay. We'll be talking also about a bit of inflation and the difference between benchmarking practices in the US versus the UK and other types of locations across Europe. I think that's a constant thing that people are practitioners are thinking about, since there's more globalization than ever. So it'll be good.
Sounds good.
Yeah, fingers crossed it's going to be good and I can ask all the questions, eh?
Yeah.
Oh, no, it'll be fine.
Yeah, that'll be good. And it depends. I mean, this time of year we may have less people on the live session.
Right.
As we get into this time of year, we seem to see attendance kind of fall off, and in the live sessions. It's just so
I
busy for
mean, it
practitioners.
really is, yeah, especially in the compensation benefits sector. I mean, crazy right now, isn't it? I mean, all the salary rounds are on, budgeting for next year, a lot of decisions to be made, so I'm not surprised.
So let's see. We got 1 minute, just enough time for me to pour my coffee. All right. All right. Okay. Well, I'll go ahead and get the slide up. We can kick off in 1 minute. So. Or can everybody see that slide?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yes.
All right. Well, welcome everybody to the Rewards Mastermind. Thank you for joining us here at the approaching the end of the year. And this is a very time of year for comp practitioners. So appreciate any of you that have the time to join us today. But before we get started, just want to give you a little bit overview of what the Rewards Mastermind is about. So basically, we're a place where we bring in compensation practitioners and reward practitioners from all over the world to talk about how do we elevate the rewards practice? How do we bring new ideas into the market so we can all benefit? And so that's the purpose of the Rewards Mastermind. So with me today, we have our host, myself. My name is Sam Reeve. I'm a pay strategist from CompTeam, and also my colleague Howard Nizewitz, also from CompTeam. We both have over 20 years of experience in compensation, both at large companies and also helping and consult small companies and medium-sized companies grow and putting in that important infrastructure. Today, I have an honored to have Sophie Janke. That's right, Sophie Janke join us today. And Sophie is a consultant at Gradar. And Gradar, as and many of our longtime listeners will know, we are big fans of Gradar. We've used them for years and I've been excited because every new release that they send out has scales and the amount of capability that the tool can do. And we're going to talk a lot about the gender pay discussion today and how it's different in the US versus the UK and other parts of the world. And we're also going to talk about how to develop fair pay practices for companies. And so there's a lot of pieces there to go through. And Gradar is an excellent platform to help accomplish that. And it's a global platform, which is great. If you want to show the platform in location you have and whether it's Poland or different parts of the world, it has you can convert the language and it can be easily understood by your colleagues. So this kind of start things off, Sophie, I would love to dive in a little bit more about your background and how you became a part of Gradar and so forth. So can you tell us, I mean, what started your compensation story? And so it's often kind of funny because when I tell compensation practitioners, they always go, yeah, when I was 12 years old, I always wanted to be, it's like nobody hears about compensation until you get into the business world, right? So
Exactly.
So what was your path?
Yeah, it's exactly as you said. I never thought I'd find myself in this position ever. But I did study media and business psychology in my undergraduate degree, and then quickly moved on to occupational and organizational psychology for my master's degree and moved to the UK for this. And I never thought I would ever say this, but here I am saying I really enjoyed statistics when I studied, and really enjoyed looking further into statistics during my degrees. So quickly realized that I really enjoy looking at numbers and working with numbers, although I'm also a people person. And I thought to combine, well, both worlds in one job, it'd be great to get into compensation benefits. And then I came across Gradar and thought it was an amazing tool. So maybe just to quickly say this as a background so you'd understand why I got the idea of working at Gradar. So Gradar is a point factor based grading system for job evaluation, and it is the foundation for any kind of job architecture, as well as compensation analysis and structuring, which was a huge part of my degree. And I thought Gradar really nicely combines job evaluation as the basis with then looking into compensation. And a lot what you do within occupational and organizational psychology is to make the world a better place for employees and organizations. To increase their well-being, to increase retention rates, to just have people committed to organizations. And in order to do that, you really need to be fair in an organization. And I think, as we all know, it all starts with pay, I would say. No one would take a job that they would absolutely be not satisfied with the pay, or at least with everything that surrounds this job when it comes to the organizational culture. So yeah, I thought this is a great tool to work with, and then applied at Gradar. And I'm lucky enough that I got the job, and I have now been with Gradar for almost a year, actually. It's getting close to that time.
Yeah,
And
well,
it's been,
congratulations.
yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. It's been a great journey. And as you said, we're constantly improving with Gradar, and it's just great to see that customer feedback gets implemented directly, and it's just fun to work for such a company. And that's how my compensation benefits journey started, and my journey as a consultant as well. I'm really happy to be part of Gradar and now be able to sit in a conversation like this to make
Yes.
the world a fairer place.
That's right. And it's been a pleasure working with you. And I know you've been a guest on the People Strategy Forum as well. And we had a time to chat there. And so it's been great, really diving into your knowledge. But one thing you mentioned that I think that is really important for us to call out today is how the rewards practice is changing from the past. I mean, if we think about, well, if Howard and I think about this, about how we first started out, it was almost kind of like a separate type of mentality. I mean, you had comp people who were really in, they're kind of a little bit introverted into their spreadsheets. They were almost considered separate from human resources, right? They would be working on the computer, and people thought it was Mr. What is that person doing over there? That kind of stuff. But in modern day, I mean, now that we're dealing with people as humans, and we understand that we need to elevate our game as reward professionals, and understand that we need to close the gap between the finite numbers and the infinite personalities that we deal with in the marketplace and day to day, and bring those together. And that's when and nothing accomplishes that more than when we start talking about fair and equal pay. And because we're talking about something that's very finite, we're talking about equal, right? I mean, that means equal, right? So it means it's more of a finite type of thing. But when we're talking about jobs, every job is different. People are different, organizations different, cultures are different, and locations are different. And so it's there's that infinite aspect there where we need to bring these two together. So I guess the first place to start here, Sophie, is what is the difference between what we would consider like a fair pay and equal pay, or I guess more appropriately, and what we technically would say the unadjusted pay gap and the adjusted pay gap.
Yeah, sorry, just to add to your point from before as well. Sometimes when I hear human resources, I cringe, because I think humans are not resources, really.
Yeah.
They are part of an organization. A lot in organizations is about, as you said, fairness, and a lot evolves around trust as well. And if we don't get trust from employees, organizations will never, ever be successful, and they will never, ever be competitive on the market as well. Because in order to be competitive, you need the buy-in from your employees. So you need to be fair. And one of the big concepts around this being fair in organizations is equal pay. What we see in the current landscape of organizations and what's happening in a lot of the legislations that get introduced in countries evolves around the gender pay gap. So the gender pay gap really just looks at the average man compared to the average woman and their pay calculated on an hourly basis. So we really look at, what they earn in comparison to each other on average. However, equal pay really means that we're paying equally for work of equal value. So we make sure that we look at the requirements of a job, and that for equal requirements and for equal work, we need to pay equally. So man and a woman doing the same job with the same requirements should be paid the same amount of money, or at least similar amounts. There are differences in pay, and they are permitted. That's absolutely fine, but the difference must be explainable, and it must be based on other reasons rather than gender, for example, or ethnicity, because ethnicity pay gaps are also a big topic that are coming up in the future. So be prepared for that already. But yeah, we really need to look at requirements and make sure that for work of equal value, we also need to pay equally. And that's the big difference between looking at the gender pay gap. That can be much more than just not paying equally, but it can also be the distribution of genders across the organization, so that you, for example, find that you have more men in higher senior role positions, for example, higher paid positions, and then more female employees in support staff, for example, in an organization. So the main point of this is you can pay equally, but have a huge gender pay gap. And the other way around, you can have no gender pay gap. Honestly, it could be like 1% only, which is really, really low, but then not pay equally for work of equal value. And I think that's really important for organizations to understand. Both concepts are completely different from each other, and they should be approached differently as well in order to become more transparent with pay, more fair, and more equitable.
Well, it's interesting. One thing that I know that this is in the UK and in places across Europe, and gender pay has been a topic for a long-standing topic for a long time, and the US is now getting caught up in a lot of areas. Mm-hmm. But one thing, when I bring up the topic in the United States and I say, okay, well, there's the unadjusted pay gap and there's the adjusted pay gap. And the unadjusted is when we're just taking the average of how men are paid versus women are paid in the company. And they're like, they look at me like, well, that doesn't make any difference. I mean, what we really need to get down is to the unadjusted pay gap. And yeah, that is true. Yeah. But the unadjusted pay gap, where we're just taking the averages instead of looking at the exact the comparable work, still tells a story. It tells a story of opportunity, right? So, mm-hmm. So when there's a big difference in the average pay between men and women in an organization, it shows if men are paid on average higher versus women are lower, even though that you look at the adjusted pay gap and you say, well, job for job, women are paid fairly, but mm-hmm. the unadjusted shows a different story, and it can be a lot of things. I think we were talking about some of those causes earlier, Sophie, about what may be causes to that, some of that unadjusted pay gap. One was, I mean, just recently we went through the pandemic, and genders actually were treated differently, or not were treated or impacted differently during during the pandemic because of some traditional roles, right?
Yeah, that's so correct. So when we recent studies, and they have just surfaced after the pandemic now, have shown that genders are completely disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. So with this current shift of new work and work 4.0, however you want to call it, really, we've seen that the flexibility that gets offered to a lot of the positions is not distributed equally across the genders. So I mentioned childcare facilities, for example, earlier, that have closed down during the pandemic. So a lot of because it is the traditional role, which I think that's another discussion to be had, but should also shift within society. But a lot of women had to stay home and move from their full-time positions into part-time positions because they could simply not basically bring into one, or bring in accordance that they had to take care of their children, but also be able to go to work. So what organizations really need to think about is flexibility. They need to be more agile and kind of offer more flexible working conditions so that every gender, whether or not they're taking care of a child, can kind of work around these issues that are surfacing because of the pandemic. And that goes far back into the discussion about traditional roles at home and basically offering equal opportunities for people. But there's only one point of this. There's another point that we see in a lot of organizations with women not having the same opportunities to actually, evolve into more senior roles. And that is, for example, because women are way less likely to discuss these developments in their career. They're less likely to also kind of discuss remote working conditions. And that's, well, there's many reasons for this, but basically, to make it short, because I haven't researched this myself, but it is in the nature of women to be less likely to discuss this. So really, what organizations in this case really need to do as well is to offer women the same opportunities to progress. The platform to discuss this flexibility, and the platform to kind of reach out and have a safe space to discuss their requirements to be able to do, the same work that men can do when they don't, for example, don't have to take care of children, and that's this case. So it reaches far back. There's a lot of problems that we see in the society when it comes to the traditional gender roles and who has to take care of what and who can flexibly kind of, schedule their time. But organizations really, really need to start thinking about this if they want to stay competitive on the market and if they want to be fair when it comes to career progression as well.
Yes, and one thing I wanted to bring up that you mentioned there is that finding a place to really talk about these issues is quite important. A lot of times companies take the perception that, well, if they're creating a women's group, that's actually, the segregation, that doesn't really help. But I would say that it does, because there's some companies call these employee resource groups when people come together with certain types of background. It could be gender related, or it could be religious affiliation or ethnicity or lifestyle, whatever it may be. But these groups are important because people can get together and kind of share their stories of how they're being impacted by certain policies that we may not be aware of as leaders, and that are impacting their organization, such as time off policies or family leave, things that like this. And so when these groups get together and discuss these issues as a group, then leaders can join in and become an ally to this group and understand the impact, and can change some of those practices, whether it's pay related or something that is directly impacts pay. So I think that is super important to consider.
Yeah, I always also like to say what isn't known can't get fixed or won't get fixed. So really, these issues need to be surfaced. They need to be made known to the organization and employer representatives, because if they don't know about it, they won't fix it, really.
Yes.
So I think it, like the ally part, to become an ally and really start changing something about this. It's really important. Also offering training for employees when it comes to hiring practices, when it comes to progression practices, and performance related pay, and removing bias from this, and just pay decisions. It's crucial to organizations when they want to be successful, when they want to stay competitive. So this extra training, it is an investment, but it's an investment that is crucial to organizations that want to survive in the current climate.
Totally agree.
I'm just thinking, there are large organizations that used to offer on-site childcare services, and now with the switch for more people, working 3-4 days from home, have organizations started to rethink how they provide childcare service? And we've seen any of that?
I mean, I don't work in a huge office building, so I can't tell you from my own perspective. But we have seen a lot of these services being removed during the pandemic just because there were no facilities for that, there were no capacities for that. There were, from like an organizational perspective, there were other problems. Although when you look at the bigger picture, this is really what's needed right now. I think employers really need to be supported more to be able to do their job.
Right.
And in order to kind of really stay committed to an organization, to retain the best talent, hire the best talent, that's exactly what organizations need to invest in. So it's not about paying more. It's not about offering, an extra 1,000 at the end of the year. It's really about offering facilities and offering opportunities and support for employees throughout these times. And we've discussed this in another forum, Sam, the other day. But it's really, really important to ensure employee well-being in that case as well, and to ensure that employees have the resources to be able to do their job properly.
Right. One other thing that I've noticed where gender impacts pay in companies in that first interface is when we're looking at candidates and bringing them into the organization. And so there's certain behavioral aspects between genders that are quite prevalent in the United States, especially. So first of all, when companies are sending out job descriptions, to recruit, sometimes they have a tendency to be very technical, or they can be very, I guess you could say, overwritten and specific. And then other ways they can be very vague and generic. And so in both cases, the studies have found that when job descriptions are vague and when they're overly specific, they count against women, and in certain ways, because men seem to have a greater propensity to deal in that obscurity, because women have traditionally been in those roles where they need to know. They need to have that flexibility and say, well, I'm taking the kids into the school at this time in the morning. I need to pick them up at this time in the afternoon. I need to what happens if somebody gets sick? I need to have flexibility to do there. And so they're very concerned about the information in the job description. And then, so when something is too general, it counts against them. And then on the other side, when it's overly specific, women have a way of being more modest when it comes to their capabilities, where men say, well, because I've never really done that before, but I think of that, I could probably, talk to some of that or do some of that particular role, where a woman says, well, no, I haven't done that before, so it's not fair for me to be able to respond to this particular job posting. So I think that's one place where compensation practitioners and reward practitioners need to look and evaluate things. The other piece I would say, and I was wondering if Sophie, you've experienced this in the UK as well, is that in the United States, women are less less likely to negotiate for a position of pay in their role. Do you see that in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, there's no study that I have read specifically about the UK, but this is a common theme, this is a common denominator, I want to say, throughout a lot of the countries and a lot of continents, that you will see that women are less likely to also kind of discuss starting salaries. And that might already, kind of well, it doesn't help that we've got a big gender pay gap here, and that we are, might not be paying equally as organizations, because men will simply just start at a higher starting salary because they are more prone to kind of discuss their starting salary. So it's really, really important to keep in mind, or like to kind of carefully monitor new working policies to make sure women are disadvantaged, also hiring practices, and also kind of to just experiment with this, experiment with remote working models, experiment what works for an organization, and what might work for one industry sector might not work for another one. So it's really important that it's no, as always, and I mean, my background is in psychology, and the one thing we always got preached is there's no one size fits all. You always have to customize, you always have to look at a specific organization and what works for this organization. So I would like to give the one hint or the one tip that helps every organization or everyone that's listening right now. But simply there is no one size fits all approach, basically. So yeah, it's just really important to remember that like fairness, equal pay, closing the gender pay gap, making hiring practices more fair, working policies more fair to not disproportionately like impact genders, is much more than a compliance. It is also, helping the organization to retain talent, to attract the best talent pool. And in the current market situation where, working or like staff is everything organizations want, and in the current situation where it's harder than ever to actually get this stuff, these are the things to think about. It's much more than just offering a good salary when you post a job. It is about, looking into the benefits, the overall surrounding context, what kind of schedule you can offer, how you hire, how you put up your job posting, what words you include, to really make sure that you think of in the UK, you call them protected characteristics as well, to really make sure that you give everyone the same chance to get a job and to progress in their job, and to be paid fairly, really. So yeah, sorry, that was a really long answer for a short question, but you will find this across the globe, basically, that when you hire, it's much easier to put in the bias than you would think as an organization. And in a time where recruitment is so much more important and the hot topic in every organization, really, this should be considered by everyone that is in a important position. That includes recruiting, really, and setting up recruitment policies, really.
Agreed. And one thing that you mentioned there is the making sure that you have those different programs, and you're not relying everything on pay. You have a well-rounded employee value proposition, in which at CompTeam we call this the workforce experience. It's not just about, I mean, we've been talking about flexibility, and that's important, but having those critical benefits that are important for your demographic is super critical in attracting the right type of talent that you want, making sure that you're hiring in a very diverse fashion, to where you're removing that bias. I mean, all of that is truly important. But I do want to mention one thing that's happening in the US here that is starting to go across the United States. I mean, so is pay transparency. So we've had some drives toward pay transparency, most recently in New York. We have laws that are coming out in California and Washington, and then we've had the longstanding head or leader of pay transparency in Colorado, but and where they're posting ranges on resumes now. And now this is another place where we need to be careful as practitioners in looking at how it is impacting gender and also ethnicity bias, because when we're posting these ranges, what's coming back is what's being reported to me by hiring managers and leaders as being the main pain point, is we're putting that range out there. And if you're posting the full range, candidates have the tendency to focus at the top of that range, right? Of course. And then recruiters, if they're trained and are on the communication around the ranges and how to direct people, they're pointing people towards the lower half of the range and saying that this is where we're focusing on hiring. But with negotiation, like we mentioned before, men are more typical to say, well, I should be at the top of the range because of X, Y, and Z. And then women are often more modest in saying, well, yeah, that sounds fair. I think that approach is appropriate, and maybe going to the lower end. So companies are dealing with the concept of, well, maybe we should just have a no negotiation policy. Have you heard that in the UK? Or are they thinking about a no negotiation policy or anything like that?
Well, I haven't heard of the no negotiation policy.
Yeah.
I know it's been a huge topic in the US, and there's a few points I wanted to make about what's specific to the US and kind of, being really transparent about pay. But I can't fully comment on the UK in this regard because yeah,
So
I
not
don't
a
want to say anything wrong. Maybe it is, but I wouldn't have enough knowledge to be able to go into more detail about this, specifically focusing on the UK. But when we think about, posting salary ranges and really making sure that people get paid fairly and that we are getting more transparent when it comes to pay, one thing that's really important in this aspect is to be justifiable when you make pay decisions. And that really ties into, and I want to mention Gradar at this point because it really, really is the perfect timing right now, because I think it is so important to kind of think about this in the bigger picture and the bigger context as well. When you make pay decisions, you need to make sure that you just don't base your pay decisions solely on the market or solely on because you've heard that person has been paid a certain amount in their previous job. It's really important to make sure that you look at the requirements of a job and determine the relative value of a job within a company. So, and that kind of ties into a point that you made right at the beginning, Sam, kind of differences between Europe and the US as well when it comes to determining pay. It's really important to kind of really look where is a specific job role located within the organization with its worth. What are the requirements of the position? How does it compare to similar positions within the same sector or similar positions within, I want to say, a department, for example? So when we think about finance, it's important to not only benchmark the accountant or like a position to an accountant, but it's important to kind of benchmark a position to the whole finance department as well, and that ties into a bigger point as well. A lot of the companies in the US tend to only look at market rates and say, well, do you know what, this is what the market is paying, so we need to go with that rate and pay the same amount to be able to, or like to stay competitive as an organization. There's a huge problem with this because there is a lot of potential bias sneaking into pay decisions in that case. What really needs to be done is an internal analysis of pay as well within organizations. In that case, Gradar is the perfect platform kind of really to look at this, because Gradar allows to actually do this analysis and do the benchmarking in one tool. So what you see a lot in Europe is that you would always go ahead as an organization, do an internal salary analysis first, look at the current distribution of pay across grades. So you determine really which grade does a job come out at, and then really look at within that grade, what does the salary range even look like? Where do we start paying? Where do we, end with our pay? What's the maximum of this grade? Like what's the highest position getting paid within this grade? And then try to kind of really keep this range as small as possible to be able to fit salary bands. And in the US, you will find that a lot of companies are basing their decisions solely on the market. But when you then think of, for example, a startup comparing themselves to market rates because they have purchased data from a benchmarking survey provider, they might be comparing themselves to really big companies like Apple or Microsoft because the data quality is quite poor or only a few companies have participated. But you don't really know who is participating because obviously the benchmarking survey won't say, well, we've had this company participating and this company participating. It is all anonymized. So it's always good to be a bit cautious and to take it with a pinch of salt when you look at benchmarking data, because you never really know how good the quality of benchmarking data is. And you will find that a lot of the time, the quality of benchmarking data is not actually good enough to solely base your decisions on this. And that's where Europe comes in as, I want to say, like a good example, because a lot of the practices in Europe include looking at the internal compensation, the internal salary, and the distribution, and then also comparing to the market, while definitely determining the relative value of a job and making sure that your salary decision is justified because the requirements of a job are this, and this. So that's why it's really, really important for organizations to do job evaluation first and really determine like really great jobs first before they go ahead and then make any salary decisions.
There's a lot in there that you mentioned, but one of the things that I want to point out is you mentioned like some of the U.S. practices and relying too much on market data, and I think there's something to be said there. And I think that a lot of U.S. practitioners don't look enough into the details when looking at market data. For instance, a common practice is that okay, I have to benchmark a financial analyst. And so a lot of practitioners will go out and they'll look, okay, well, here's financial analyst. And basically this is a career level or fully ramped career professional. And so I'm going to choose this level. And then they come back and they do their analysis and they present their data. But the one thing that's lacking there is that if you really look at all the different levels in that financial analysis job family, and you look at how the data is spaced out, you'll see that it's a bit chunky. And when I say chunky, I mean like if you took a loaf of bread and that classifies as from the minimum pay range to the highest pay range in that function of financial analysis, and you looked at where the slices were, you would find that not all the slices are the same width. Some are really narrow, some are wide, and it's very volatile by where you're looking at. So so when a compensation practitioner is just looking at a specific level out of that loaf of bread, so to speak, they may choose a particular section that is not quite where they thought it would be in the marketplace. And so to really look at this equitably, you have to look at the entire family. And then to your point, Sophie, making sure that you're also looking at from an internal valuation perspective as well. Not only looking at current incumbents in the role to evaluate compression issues and so forth like that, but also maybe my company doesn't value financial analysts as much as another company does in the industry. And maybe we need to invest more or less in this position, invest more or less in those positions that are driving a strategic outcome for the firm. So I think that's a very important piece of what you mentioned about what Gradar can provide, that consistency and fairness, and then removing that bias from the decision-making process.
Yeah, I think a lot of time there's a rush for managers. I need to hire, and it's like, okay, just go on the market and find the data. And you really need to understand when we go, because you could have two managers talking about hiring financial analysts, but if you don't dig in and understand what each of those managers are looking for, they can be completely different roles. So the first thing should be really to understand what it is that's critical in that position. What are the responsibilities? What is being expected of the person fulfilling that role? And I think too often there's just this push to, we got to fill it now, so go out in the market and get the data and let's just hire.
Yeah, and that's another point as well there, because I think a lot of practitioners think from a perspective that they think, well, it's equal pay for the same jobs. So financial analysts must be paid the same. However, if you think about a position that has the same authority or the same far-reaching decisions, that get brought into the organization, the same organizational knowledge that you need to have, the same professional experience, for example, you need to pay them at least in the same range, because it's not about, the job title. A job title can be so misleading. It's really about making sure that you determine what are the requirements of a specific position. And if you have at least, well, it doesn't have to be identical, but if you have the same or like comparable requirements for jobs, you need to pay equally. You need to pay fairly and kind of compare, well, if someone has more requirements or higher, like if a position has higher requirements, you need to pay that position the same as a position, you know, with similar requirements. So I think that's really important to understand. It's not about the job title here. It's not about paying for the same work, the same amount of money, but it's also for the same value of work for the organization.
That's right. And I think that if we looked at this, I mean, because some people out there are saying, well, you know, the market says this job should be paid higher than this job, even if they're at the same scope of work. And that may be true, but we have to think of what is driving that difference in the marketplace. And typically it has to do with the supply and demand of that particular role. Because if it has the same amount of complexity at that level and the same scope within that level, you would, in all other things equal, you would think that it would be paid the same, but the differences in supply and demand may cause a certain role to be paid higher but over time, we would expect that to level or equalize over time.
That's a really good point there. And there's a I think a good example that you can kind of take. When you think about, you know, two positions and they both come out on grade 8 within Gradar, right? And then one is in the information security or the information technology sector, for example, and one is a support role, but they really end up on the same grade, right? You don't want to discriminate someone based on their choice for their job. So you want to make sure that if they both come out on an 8, they are being paid similarly, and not because, you know, only the demand for IT is really high at the moment on the market. And that's why it's so important to kind of tie back to the point that we made earlier, to not only look at a certain job family specifically only, but also have a tool, and that is Gradar, a tool that is also job family overarching, really, because yeah, same value, same pay, I want to say, or similar pay.
That's right. And one other thing you mentioned, Sophie, is that you were saying that we need to look internally and to do that internal analysis, and when we're bringing on those jobs and looking at pricing those jobs. And here's another situation that I know that we need to talk about, and has been the impact of inflation. And the impact of inflation has moved into some of job pricing for positions out there, and companies are seeing that compression is taking place, meaning that the people that they're hiring from the marketplace are at a higher level than some of those people that are internally. And this is where we need to do the internal analysis, not only for to evaluate compression, but also from a pay fairness standpoint, seeing how our population of women are being impacted. I don't know how many times I've witnessed this in companies where they say, well, we need to hire this person right away. They're just on the marketplace, and they came from Google, and and we need to pay a little bit higher in the range. And then they make the decision to do that and bring in this very highly paid person within that level, and then throw all their gender pay analytics out the window, and by bringing that person in. So there can be heavy consequences by not doing that internal analysis. So, but I'm glad that there's tools like Gradar out there that can help show lay out this important infrastructure to show this detail.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point, because I think one of the biggest risks for organizations right now is to make decisions that will influence the viability of the whole compensation strategy on the long run. So really, organizations, when they make pay decisions right now, they need to make sure it's sustainable. And I think that kind of ties into this whole market situation at the moment. You can't just make a situation out there as an organization in terms of pay that you'll regret in a few months' time, because, for example, inflation rates go down again. And I think the one solution here that is that will help you to justify your pay decisions is really like grade-based pay bands, for example. So when you find out a grade 4 job based on the requirements, and grading the requirements, and having, you know, like factors that you use, like standardized factors that you use to grade positions within organizations, that's the solution that will help you to kind of make decisions in terms of pay that are sustainable and that are viable for organizations in the long run.
So, Sophie, I'd like to dig in a little bit more to in inflation and how we should be looking at that for pay fairness and how it's impacting companies, because I know that here in the United States, inflation's been running at that 8% level and starting to taper down a little bit. But and what companies have found is that they haven't seen a equivalent movement in the hiring demand. I mean, basically, they're finding that candidates are still pretty scarce and they're still demanding those higher rates of pay. And then to further complicate this is there's a little bit of uncertainty in what next year's economy is going to look like. Are we going to recover, or is it going to continue to go down? And so companies are in this very precarious position of whether or not they're seeing that the market rates have gone up in the surveys, and they're saying, should we pay higher? And should we give that higher merit increase that we're expecting on doing this year? Or should we pull back or be more prudent? What are you seeing in Europe?
Yeah, it's the same in Europe. I think just in general, like the whole situation at the moment, a global pandemic, a fundamental shift in how jobs are structured, this is all causing employees to really go to their organizations and say, well, inflation rates are at 10% and your 10% pay raise. One of the biggest problems here is that I think organizations do not clearly communicate how pay decisions or what pay decisions are based on. And it's not solely the cost of living. Cost of living impacts everyone differently based on the location that you're at, based on, like how you live, what products you buy, whether you own a car or not, whether you have a long travel or like a long way to work. It really, really impacts everyone differently. And I think one of the biggest problems is that organizations kind of really fail to explain to employees that they administer pay levels not based on the cost of living, but more on the cost of labor, really, and the value of labor. So this creates really unrealistic expectations for employees coming in and saying, well, I need a pay raise of so and so much percent to kind of be able to pay for my products. So yeah, this is something that organizations really need to think about when they think about, going with the inflation rates. And that is, again, kind of underlining the point I made earlier. If you go ahead and make a decision with your organization in regarding to compensation structures that is not sustainable, you and your organization will not be successful in the next years. So I think one way you could be looking at this is, instead of really going ahead and saying we're going to increase salary for everyone, because we can't really reverse that in the next years, whether or not inflation stays at this rate or not. And there is speculations about, the inflation rate going down again. However, I think COVID, more than anything else, has shown us that we don't really know what's happening, whether or not we're forecasting things or not. And if the inflation rate doesn't go down again, you will be kind of bound, or you will have to stick to your increased salaries. So I think one way you could approach this is really to look at bonus structures at the moment, to kind of have a one-time payment and kind of just increase, I want to say, the cash expense you have for your employees, because this is something you can reverse. You can pay a bonus, or you can adjust bonus payments right now to account for that high inflation rate and to account for the increased cost of living for a short amount of time, without necessarily changing your compensation philosophy for the next 10 years and not being able to reverse this, which can be really detrimental to a company. If you now, and I think, salaries are one of the biggest things organizations can calculate with. If you now increase all salaries within your organization and you can't go back, it might cost you a lot of money, and it might even cost you your competitiveness in the market and your budget for the next years. So you would be less flexible to react to other situations that are happening on the market. So this is one way you could be looking at it, is really the benefits and the bonus payments, and kind of adjust this for employees at the moment, because it is cash payments in the end, and it will help employees, but it won't necessarily then negatively impact your organization and your compensation philosophy in the long run.
Totally agree. That's a great tool, and every company out there should assess whether or not this is the right approach for them. I mean, in some organizations, it could be, continuing on with the merit approach and building that into the base salaries may be completely appropriate based on their comp philosophy, and others might find that a spot bonus or a bonus in lieu of a merit increase may be a more prudent way to go for this year. So it's definitely. But it's important to understand the consequences of those actions, right? If you're paying out a bonus in lieu of a merit increase, we need to realize how that's impacting the organization from a cost perspective, and we're basically moving all the cash impact to earlier in the year, where that would be spread out through the year. So make sure you talk to your finance department when it comes to that. The other thing is just how that will how that's communicated to your employees. It's super important for them to understand what you're trying to accomplish with this piece, and delivering appropriate messaging around it, such as, a common one is, hey, we're trying to make sure that you have more money in your hands now to help with the inflationary impact, but this is a one-time event, and this is not something that's going to continue on, so they don't have expectations for the future. So that's super important to ensure that you're laying out that expectation. And other things. I mean, but communication is so important in all of these pieces, because and it's hard to win, but it's very important that you have a very knowledgeable and capable person that understands how to communicate these appropriately to your particular demographic, because it's not a one size fits all, for sure.
Yeah, and that is, again, really, really important to understand that in this case, even, it is completely different for one organization than it might be for another one. So for one organization, it might really work to just provide other forms of support, such as financial advice, training on financial budgeting for employees, just offering resources so that employees can plan for their personal use, really. It doesn't necessarily need to benefit the organization in the first instance, as in saying, well, like, we're offering you training that you can use for your personal life to budget your private income, basically. And then for others, it might help to give more flexibility and kind of, changing remuneration packages, for example. So you'll be looking at, even if it's only for a short amount of time, but maybe decreasing the amount of money you put towards your pension, but rather, having this paid out for a short amount of time to be able to adjust to the rising cost of living that we are all experiencing, I want to say, everywhere in the world right now. So really, there's so many ways of support, and it doesn't necessarily have to include, raising salaries. But if you don't communicate this properly to your employees, you really need to manage expectations for employees, because if they, in the end of the day, think that you have to raise salary to be able to account for this raising cost of living, that's not true. But it needs to be communicated so we still stay fair. And that is one of the first points I made in this talk, is trust and fairness for employees is one of the main reasons they stay within organizations. And we don't want to hurt trust. We don't want to take this away from employees, because in the end of the day, without employees, organizations are nothing. So they only work with employees, really. So it's really important to make sure that everyone is feeling fairly treated, equally treated, or at least that we are trying our best as organizations, as employee representatives, as practitioners, to go in the right direction. You can't change things overnight, but it's really important to look into this and say, well, we are working on this, give us our feedback so we can continually work on this in the next so many years.
Right. Well, thank you, Sophie. Well, I know we are coming up on running short on time, and I would like to spend a little bit of time just showing our listeners here a little bit about how Gradar can help them and fair pay and so forth. So can you walk us through that, Sophie?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I think there is multiple ways to really look into paying fairly, and there's one thing I'd like to mention right at the beginning here. I want to share. So I think it is really important to, start with a gender pay gap analysis, because as I said earlier, what you don't know, you can't change. So I think it's a really, really good idea to start with really looking at the unadjusted gender pay gap. So you can go ahead and really see, well, what's the difference between, the average earning, or like the earning of an average man and women within an organization when you look at the hourly pay or at the annual pay. And this is kind of the first starting point to really do these analysis, to really look into this. One more thing, though, that has become quite clear when looking at gender pay gap reporting in the UK is that no unadjusted gender pay gap helps any organization if they don't add a narrative. And I really like to take airlines as an example, because you will always find a huge gender pay gap, at least for the next few years, in airlines, because you will find that a lot of the floor staff basically is female. And you'll find that a lot of the pilots are male. And this is because a lot of the pilots, or like, I want to say, like, male employees or male prospects are more likely to pass the pilot test, because they've got a better, I think it was 4D imagination. So yeah, you'll find a lot more male pilots within the aviation industry than you will find female pilots. And that is the same with any airline that you find out there. You'll always have more pilots than female pilots. However, this is a gender pay gap that you can explain because of these reasons. This is something that on the long run you will have to look into, and that you will have to kind of work around. But you need a tool to analyze this. You won't find the reason for your gender pay gap by solely looking at the gender pay gap. You really also need to look at the demographics. And when you look at the demographics, it becomes quite clear that a lot of the organizations have the typical glass ceiling that practitioners are talking about, or researchers are talking about. So really, what you need is, when you look at the gender pay gap, is to add a narrative. And what you need to add a narrative, to be able to add a narrative, is to look at the gender distribution in your organization. You need to really determine on which grade do we have, which amount of genders. And only this will allow you to really explain the gender pay gap. And what also helps with this is the adjusted gender pay gap. So with Gradar, for example, we've got the option to kind of run a few regression analysis in the background and really say, well, on top of gender, we also need to consider other factors. We call them, we call them kind of additional factors, configurations of a gender pay gap analysis, where you can, for example, take into consideration and control for, in more statistical terms, control for other variables, such as the age, such as the job family, such as the length of tenure. And I mean, it's not, well, if you look at a adjusted gender pay gap, and you'll find that the gender pay gap looks way less when you consider age as well. This might give you an indication that you don't only have a gender bias, but you might also have an age bias, within your company. And really looking at the adjusted gender pay gap, really looking at the distribution of salaries and the distribution of genders across the grades. That's what helps you to understand why you have a gender pay gap, or if you have a gender pay gap but you're still paying equally. And that's, I think, what every organization should do. And this is something that Gradar really nicely combines. We're not the typical reporting tool for gender pay gap, but really like an analysis, an insight tool that allows you to look into the gender pay gap in more detail, to have an explanation for your gender pay gap, to look for the causes and reasons, and to find points where you would start with initiatives to work against this gender pay gap, or to work against the inequalities in pay or the bias in pay decisions that you might have within an organization. And that's really what Gradar combines very nicely, is this unadjusted and adjusted gender pay gap that you won't find in many other reporting tools, where you really solely put in your data and then they give you, just a definite amount or like a percentage amount of a gender pay gap. Yeah, it really helps to add a narrative around your gender pay gap, and to justify why a gender pay gap might be existing in an organization.
Yeah, one thing that I find is when I look at different tools that are out there, there's some tools that are a pay gap tool first, and then they may do some compensation. So what's unique about Gradar is a compensation tool that also does gender pay gap analysis. So it's very robust in the compensation functionality, which I love, and that's the reason why we use that internally. So
yeah, sorry, just to add to this, because I've just talked about the gender pay gap analysis and what we can do with in terms of analyzing gender pay gaps. But Gradar is much more than that. I just brought it up in more detail because it was the topic of this discussion. But I think one thing you just mentioned, Sam, what's really great about Gradar is that you, first of all, you base all your compensation analysis and structuring modules on job evaluation. So you really determine the worth of your positions first, and you then go ahead and do the analysis. But you don't only have the option to internally analyze your compensation, but you can also you can also benchmark to market rates, and you can do the gender pay gap analysis. You can even kind of calculate with a comparison analysis tool to market rates and to internal rates. You can really even look at how much it will cost the organization, and it helps with budgeting for the next year, how much it will cost the organization to bring everyone up to the minimum of the pay band. So I want to say it is like the one solution for for everything that evolves around compensation analysis and structuring within organizations, but based on a standardized approach that will help you to justify your pay decisions.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Sophie, for sharing all your wisdom today on not just Gradar, but the equal pay in general and the different jurisdictions across the globe. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You're so welcome. Thank you so much for having me. You're so much fun.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. See you next month on the Rewards Mastermind. I hope you enjoyed this session. I thought it was a great discussion. So see you next month. Have a great holiday season.
Yes.
Bye.
Bye, everyone, and Merry Christmas.